A Fayetteville cop pulled over a calm, polite driver, then dismissed his FBI badge like it meant nothing. What happened next turned the entire town upside down. Troy Fenwick was sweating through his uniform, the collar of his shirt damp where it clung to his neck. August in Cumberland County, North Carolina, meant hot pavement, sun that burned through the window glass, and drivers too used to ignoring stop signs in quiet, gated neighborhoods. That was his excuse anyway. But Troy wasn't thinking about traffic patterns when he flipped on the lights behind a black BMW 540 with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. The car had just merged onto Skibo Road without signaling. Barely. Not something he'd usually bother with, especially this close to his lunch break. But something about that car, or maybe the driver. He didn't know. Couldn't say. Just a gut feeling, or so he'd later claim. As the BMW slowed and pulled neatly onto the shoulder near a golf course entrance, Troy tapped his fingers against the steering wheel and let the engine idle. He scanned the license plate again. Ohio. He didn't like that. He stepped out, adjusted his belt, and walked over, his posture exaggerated, thumb grazing the latch of his holster. Inside, the driver rolled the window down halfway. A black man, maybe late 40s, clean-shaven, neatly dressed in a tailored light blue shirt and navy slacks. Hands at 10 and 2. Watch on his left wrist. A silver Tag Heuer. Afternoon, the man said, his voice calm and steady. Was there a reason for the stop, officer? Troy cocked his head slightly. The man's tone was polite, but there was something behind it. Not attitude, just control. That irritated him. You didn't signal when you changed lanes back there, Troy said, squinting as he looked into the car. License and registration? The man reached slowly for his wallet. I see. I thought I had. My apologies if I missed it. Troy kept watching. The man moved with deliberate precision. No sudden gestures, no talking back, but no fear either. He handed over the license and registration without looking away. Deshaun Tramble. Troy took the documents and walked back to his cruiser, muttering the name under his breath. He didn't run it yet. He sat with the door open, radio silent, just watching the man in the mirror. Why was this guy here? In this neighborhood? In that car? He got out again and walked back up, this time standing a little closer to the open window. Where you headed? He asked. Tramble looked at him. His eyes were direct, not confrontational, just firm. Just left Fort Liberty. Headed back to my hotel. You military? No. Then what were you doing on base? Tramble paused. Briefing. Briefing? For what? Another pause. Work. Troy's jaw shifted slightly. What kind of work? I'd prefer not to discuss that roadside, officer. Troy let out a short laugh. That right? Inside the car, Tramble didn't move. He just kept looking straight ahead. Look, I don't care how fancy that car is, Troy continued, voice louder now. If you think you're gonna give me attitude... I didn't give you attitude, Tramble interrupted evenly. You asked a question. I answered within my rights. The tone was still calm, but there was steel in it now. Unshakable. Step out of the vehicle. That made Tramble finally look up at him fully. There was no anger in his eyes, just stillness. Are you asking me to exit my vehicle, Officer Fenwick? Troy blinked. The man had read his nameplate without glancing down. Yeah, step out. Tramble reached into his inner jacket pocket, slowly, and pulled out a black leather wallet. He flipped it open, then held it up without a word. Troy leaned in. The badge was real. The ID was real. Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the name matched. Special Agent Deshaun Tramble. Now, a normal officer might have backed off, apologized, maybe even laughed it off. But Troy? He squinted at the ID for half a second, then straightened up like nothing had changed. Huh, that's supposed to mean something. Tramble didn't react. Not visibly, but something in his face hardened. Still no emotion, no threat, just quiet understanding. I'll be making a phone call now, he said. You're not being detained, Troy shot back. I know, Tramble replied, taking out his phone. But I think it's time someone else is aware of this stop, Troy smirked. Go ahead. You think I care who you call? Tramble didn't respond. He hit a single contact and raised the phone to his ear. No passcode, no hesitation. Hey, it's me. Yes, right now. Skibo and Briarwood. Send them. He ended the call. No names, no drama. Troy stepped back from the car, still puffed up. That's supposed to scare me? Tramble rolled the window up halfway again. And that was it. No yelling, no insults. Just one quiet phone call that would change everything. But what Troy didn't realize was that those words had already set things in motion far beyond his control. Troy Fenwick paced a little beside his cruiser, pretending to check the side mirror, eyes flicking between the road, the BMW, and the occasional passing car. His stomach tightened, not out of fear, but something closer to resentment. He'd been on the force almost 5 years, enough time to know when someone was bluffing. But this? Something about the way Tramble spoke, too calm, too confident, rubbed him raw. Inside the BMW, Agent Deshawn Tramble adjusted the air vent and glanced at the dashboard clock. He wasn't rattled, but he wasn't exactly relaxed either. The interaction wasn't new to him. He'd been through worse. Overseas, in back rooms with no cameras. But those moments had structure. This one had arrogance. Troy walked back up to the window, hands now on his belt, tone sharper. So what is it you do, exactly? Tramble didn't answer right away. He turned his head slowly, then looked Troy in the eye. You saw the badge? It's all there. I'm asking you to explain it to me, Troy insisted. You're not required to ask that, and I'm not required to answer. Look, I don't care what agency you work for. Out here on this road, I'm in charge. Tramble sighed through his nose, not out of frustration, but calculation. He wasn't worried about himself. He was thinking ahead, to how this could play out and who else might get pulled into it. Officer Fenwick, he said slowly. Are you detaining me? I'm trying to verify a few things. You're not under arrest. So am I free to go? Troy hesitated. Just for a split second. That was the moment Tramble knew the man wasn't used to someone calmly drawing lines. I'm going to ask you to step out, Troy said again. We can talk about this without the window between us. No, Tramble replied, still composed. I have identified myself, complied with all legal requirements, and I do not consent to unnecessary escalation. Troy stepped back again. His pulse quickened. That part irritated him the most. How calm this man was. How it felt like Tramble had already mapped out the entire encounter before it even started. Are you refusing to exit your vehicle? I'm refusing to make this easier for you to abuse protocol. Troy's face turned a shade redder. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not from someone he thought he had power over. You think that badge gives you a free pass? I think that badge represents 23 years of service. I think I've stood across from men who actually were threats. I think I've kept this country safer than you'll ever understand. And I think, he paused just long enough for the silence to land, you're playing a very dangerous game with the wrong person. That cut deeper than Troy expected. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. Why are you even in this neighborhood? Visiting someone? Got business with someone around here? No, Tramble didn't blink. I'm staying at the Crosswinds Hotel, 2 miles from here. This route was just part of my GPS. Troy didn't believe it, or didn't want to. You working a case? Tramble didn't answer. He just stared. Quiet again. You always act like this when someone pulls you over? No, Tramble said, his tone like glass. Only when I'm treated like I don't belong somewhere, I absolutely do. That landed differently. For just a second, it cracked the performative toughness Troy was clinging to. But pride is a hard thing to let go of. I'll tell you what's going to happen, Troy said, puffing out his chest. I'm going to call this in, and we'll see if your little agency backs you up. Tramble didn't move. They already have. That's when Troy heard it. The crunch of tires behind him. He turned around and saw a black Suburban slow to a stop behind his cruiser. Unmarked plates, tinted windows. Then another, just like it, pulling in behind the first. Tramble sat still, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh. Troy's hand hovered near his radio. Two men in suits stepped out from the first vehicle. They didn't move fast. No weapons drawn, just straight backs, earpieces, and quiet coordination. One of them glanced at Troy, then at the BMW. "You Fenwick?" he asked calmly. "Yeah. Who are you?" "Stand by." They didn't even look at Tramble. Didn't need to. They knew who he was. That was clear. Troy suddenly felt like a kid who had kicked the wrong door open. He reached for his radio, but his hand didn't quite touch it. Something about the way these men carried themselves, silent, professional, unmistakably in charge, made his stomach twist. But the real gut punch was still coming, and it would come in less than 4 minutes. The men from the Suburbans moved like they'd rehearsed it, every step purposeful, every glance calculated. They didn't raise their voices or flash their badges like TV cops. They didn't need to. Authority was written in how they stood, how they didn't flinch when Troy Fenwick tried to assert control over a situation that was no longer his. Troy cleared his throat, took a few steps toward them, and asked again, louder this time. "Who are you with?" The first man, late 40s, lean build, dark suit, nodded toward the BMW without even making eye contact with Troy. "You pulled him over." Troy shifted his weight. "Yeah. Improper lane change." Uh-huh. It wasn't a question, just a tone that said, "We've heard this kind of thing before." The second man stepped forward and calmly asked, "Has Agent Tramble been placed under arrest?" "No, I was just conducting—" "Is he suspected of a crime?" Troy hesitated. "Not exactly." The man didn't say anything, just stared. Then he took out a small phone, turned slightly away and made a call. His voice was quiet, but not secretive. Meanwhile, Agent Tramble remained in the driver's seat, untouched, unmoved. His phone was face down on the console now, but his eyes followed every movement outside. He'd seen this pattern in a dozen different cities, in 5 different languages. Arrogance giving way to confusion. Confusion giving way to fear. Troy tried to regain footing. "Look, this guy was being evasive. He wouldn't tell me what he was doing here." "Because he doesn't have to," the first man said plainly. "He's federal. You initiated a stop, asked him where he was going, and demanded he exit the vehicle after he showed credentials. Is that correct?" Troy stiffened. "He had a badge. That doesn't mean I can't ask questions." "Sure," the man replied. "But the minute you saw federal ID, that should have been it. You escalated without cause." "I didn't escalate anything." "He made a phone call. He brought this on himself." The agent raised an eyebrow. "He brought it on himself by informing his chain of command that he was being stopped without justification?" Troy's mouth opened, but no words came out. It was then that another vehicle approached, this one a dark grey sedan with government plates. Out stepped a woman in a navy blazer, crisp white blouse and low heels. She looked composed but firm, her ID already in hand. "Special Liaison Quinn Broccoli, U.S. Attorney's Office," she said, walking past the Suburbans straight toward the cruiser. "Officer Fenwick, correct?" Troy nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Please explain what prompted this traffic stop." He swallowed. "He changed lanes without signaling. That's all." She gave a tight nod, then turned toward Agent Tramble, who finally stepped out of his vehicle. His presence outside the car was no less composed, tall, shoulders back, eyes steady. He adjusted his cuffs as he walked toward Broccoli. "Agent Tramble," she said, extending a hand. "You all right?" "Yes, no damage, just familiarity." She gave a small, sympathetic smile, then turned back to Troy. "You're aware this man holds TS-SCI clearance, yes?" Troy blinked. "TS what?" "Top secret sensitive compartmented information. He's a lead investigator on 2 active foreign counter-intel operations and was briefed this morning by both the Defense Intelligence Agency and National Security Council liaisons. This stop should have lasted 90 seconds. It's now entering minute 26. Troy's heart dropped. He felt it. Something colder than embarrassment. It was shame, but it hadn't fully set in yet. Broccoli continued. "Your body camera is active." "Yes." "Good. Keep it that way. You're going to stand right there while we conduct a full internal review. Supervisory officers have already been contacted. You'll be escorted back to the station for immediate debrief. Pending outcome, you may be placed on administrative leave. I was just doing my job, he muttered. No. Tramble finally spoke, voice calm but razor sharp. You were doing what you think your job is, and you let bias guide your instinct instead of reason. Troy turned to him, face red, but didn't reply. Not now. Not with this many witnesses. A patrol unit rolled up at that moment, likely called by the dispatcher just in case things escalated. The uniformed sergeant who stepped out looked at the agents, then at Tramble, and instantly understood who'd made the mess. Officer Fenwick, the sergeant called gently. Why don't you come over here with me? He walked off, slow and stiff. Tramble didn't look smug. He didn't look pleased. There was no satisfaction in his face, just stillness, measured, disappointed, like a teacher watching a student blow an easy test. Broccoli gave him a glance. You want to file? No, not worth it. The camera will say it all. But the camera wasn't the only thing watching, and what it captured would explode far louder than any ticket ever could. Officer Troy Fenwick sat on the edge of a low concrete barrier a few feet from his cruiser, his foot bouncing uncontrollably. Sweat stuck to his back and underarms. The heat wasn't letting up, and neither was the pressure. He kept replaying it in his head. How Tramble stayed so calm, how the Suburbans showed up out of nowhere, how that woman from the U.S. Attorney's office walked straight past him like he wasn't even there. It didn't feel real. And yet every second of it had been recorded. His own body cam was still running. The sergeant who had arrived last, a man named Leo Bransfield, stood nearby, arms crossed, saying nothing. He didn't look angry, just exhausted. Like a father watching his grown son make a mistake he couldn't undo. Inside the Suburban, one of the agents was on the phone, windows rolled up. The other walked a few paces away with Broccoli. They kept their voices low, but it was clear they were coordinating the report. Tramble remained by his car, not pacing, not talking, just present. He hadn't even taken his tie off. That silence started to weigh heavier than anything Troy had expected. He had hoped for shouting, defensiveness, maybe even some threat to get loud or pull rank. Instead, Tramble had made one phone call, and the weight of it was still falling. Troy turned to Bransfield. You ever seen anything like this? Bransfield didn't answer right away. Then he exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said. Once. Different city, different guy. Didn't end well then either. Troy rubbed his face. I didn't know who he was. He wasn't wearing a suit. Just looked normal. Bransfield looked at him now. And what did you expect him to look like? That question hung in the air. Troy didn't answer. Down the road, Tramble checked his phone. No urgency, no sign of tension, just a glance at the time. He could have driven off by now. He wasn't under arrest, and he hadn't been charged with anything. But he stayed. Inside one of the SUVs, the agent on the phone leaned forward, mouth close to the mic. Yes, sir. Confirmed. Credentials match. TS level, yes. No, he did not resist. No aggression from him. Bodycam footage intact. Understood. We'll hold position until further notice. He hung up and stepped out, making his way back to Broccoli. DC's been notified, he said. And he's not the only one who made a call. Looks like someone from the Defense Department's Legal Affairs Office also rang Internal Affairs directly. Broccoli raised an eyebrow. Didn't waste time. Nope. She turned back toward Tramble and gave him a respectful nod. You know how fast that chain reacts when someone at his level rings the bell? He barely said 10 words, the agent muttered. Didn't even name names. That's because he doesn't have to. Troy watched from the sideline. Every conversation he couldn't hear just made things worse in his mind. He couldn't control the story anymore, and he hated that. It felt like slipping underwater with weights tied to his legs. Finally, Broccoli walked over to him, not with a scolding face, not angry, just firm. You'll be contacted within 48 hours, she said. Internal Affairs will schedule a review. You're expected to cooperate fully, and until then, you are not to engage with press, release statements, or discuss the nature of today's stop with anyone outside your command chain. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. You'll return to the station with Sergeant Bransfield. Leave your cruiser there. Administrative leave begins immediately. Yes, ma'am. She didn't wait for follow-ups. She turned and walked back toward the Suburbans. Troy stood up slowly, unsure whether to feel relieved or devastated. He looked at Tramble, who had just slipped his phone into his pocket, and turned toward his car. "Hey," Troy called, unsure why he was even speaking. "You could have told me right off the bat who you were. You knew how this looked." Tramble didn't break stride, but he paused before opening the door. Then, finally, he spoke. "You already decided what you saw before you asked a single question." And with that, he got in, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. No sirens, no high-speed exit, just a smooth turn back into the world. But the storm wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning, and it wouldn't be long before the whole country saw what really happened. By the time Agent Tramble's BMW turned the corner and disappeared down Briarwood Lane, Officer Troy Fenwick was already in the back seat of Sergeant Bransfield's patrol unit. Not cuffed, not restrained, but boxed in by the weight of his own actions. Bransfield didn't say much on the ride back. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional squawk from the radio. Troy kept looking out the window, but he wasn't really seeing anything. His mind was back on that roadside, on the calm face of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. At the station, Troy handed in his cruiser keys and filled out the beginning of an incident report. Bransfield stood near the door like a sentry, arms crossed, waiting to walk him out. By then, the video was already on its way out into the world. It started with a simple upload to a private server, standard procedure for federal oversight. But within hours, a snippet had been leaked. Not by Tramble, not by the agents, not even by anyone from the U.S. Attorney's Office. It came from inside the department, someone who had seen enough, someone who knew the silence wasn't going to fix it. The footage was raw, wide angle, slightly distorted, but clear enough. It showed Officer Fenwick standing over a calm, seated Agent Tramble, asking where he was going, questioning his presence, and downplaying the badge that had been handed to him in full view. One moment stood out, one that caught everyone's attention. Troy, in the middle of the clip, says with a smirk, "Huh, that's supposed to mean something?" And Tramble, unmoved, responds, "I think it will." That line, that quiet line, spread like wildfire. It wasn't just Black Twitter. It wasn't just watchdog groups or local activists. It was veterans, former federal agents, military families, and middle-aged professionals across the country who saw themselves in Tramble's restraint. The story hit national headlines by morning. Fayetteville officer stops Black FBI agent. Escalates despite ID. News anchors read quotes from the body cam. Podcasts picked it apart. One former federal prosecutor called it a textbook example of institutional ego colliding with professional discipline. Inside the Fayetteville PD, phones didn't stop ringing. Reporters camped outside the precinct. Emails flooded the mayor's office. But back at a hotel just off the I-95 corridor, Agent Tramble sat in a second-floor room, drinking black coffee in silence. He wasn't watching the news. His phone vibrated constantly. Texts from colleagues, higher-ups, even old contacts from overseas. He responded to none of them. There was no joy in what had happened. No relief, just fatigue. And an unspoken awareness that if things had gone even slightly differently, the ending might have been far worse. Meanwhile, Troy Fenwick sat in his apartment watching the story unfold on his own screen. His name was trending. His face was in every screen grab. Even old classmates he hadn't spoken to in years were tagging him in threads with phrases like, "and how embarrassing." The worst part wasn't the suspension. It was knowing that for the rest of his life, a single moment of arrogance had branded him. A panel discussion on cable news dissected the clip. One guest, a retired black federal marshal named Quentin Maris, said something that hit harder than any headline. "People think the badge gives you power, but it's not the badge. It's how you carry it." That officer. He thought the uniform made him the authority. But real authority. That comes from how you treat people when you think nobody's watching. That agent showed more restraint in 30 minutes than most men show in a lifetime. Back at the station, some of Troy's fellow officers had already started to avoid eye contact. A few made awkward comments in the locker room. One said, "You didn't mean it, man." Another said, "It's just bad optics." But optics weren't the problem. It was the truth on video. And the truth didn't blink. But the real shift wasn't happening in the comments or the headlines. It was happening in kitchens, living rooms, and break rooms, where regular people were asking one question: how often does this happen when there's no camera at all? By early Friday morning, Special Liaison Quinn Broccoli had been on 4 calls, 3 Zoom briefings, and 1 silent drive down to the federal building in Raleigh, all related to one thing: that traffic stop. The moment she walked through the glass doors of the DOJ's Eastern District office, her inbox lit up again. Journalists, civil rights groups, internal affairs. Even a contact at the Department of Homeland Security had reached out. Not with questions, just with the subject line: saw the footage. Quinn had been in this game a long time. She wasn't the type to jump at headlines. But something about this incident, its clarity, its restraint, its timing, hit a nerve across every level of government. She took a breath, closed her office door, and pulled up the full body cam video again. Not the edited clips going viral, the real version. The one with the full 32-minute runtime and 0 commentary. She watched it all. No skipping. Tramble never raised his voice, never stepped out of line, didn't need to. He gave space for the officer to rethink his behavior, and when that didn't happen, he made a phone call. That call, Quinn now knew, went directly to a national-level FBI liaison assigned to a classified task force. And from there, it only took minutes for it to reach her desk. Which is why she was the one who arrived on scene Thursday, in a government sedan, with full knowledge of who Agent Tramble was and what kind of work he handled. And she didn't come alone. What the public hadn't seen, yet, were the follow-up meetings. The debriefings, the classified memos circulated internally, warning departments nationwide to revisit protocol when interacting with federal personnel during field operations. Because what most people didn't know was that Tramble hadn't just come from a base. He had come from a closed-door briefing on a known foreign infiltration effort. The man had spent months coordinating asset monitoring across 3 states. He had clearance higher than 90% of the agents in the region. Troy Fenwick had pulled over someone with deeper federal clearance than the majority of the state's law enforcement directors, and treated him like a random trespasser. Quinn opened a folder marked Internal, not for distribution, and scanned the notes from a supervisor in Langley. If Tramble had felt even slightly threatened and activated a security alert, our office would have been forced to shut down active operations in 2 counties. The implications of a mishandled stop involving someone in his position are not minor. That was the part nobody outside the walls of Washington understood. This wasn't just about attitude or perception. It was about national security. The chain reaction that could have happened if Tramble had reacted differently or been treated more aggressively would have caused more damage than a dozen viral clips ever could. Meanwhile, back in Fayetteville, a mandatory department-wide training was quietly announced. Officers were told to clear their calendars the following Monday. Attendance was not optional. The official reason? Advanced de-escalation and identification procedures. But everyone knew what it was really about. At a corner diner near the courthouse, 2 off-duty officers sipped bitter coffee in silence, watching the clip on one of their phones. "I mean, he didn't even yell," one said. The other shook his head. He didn't have to. That was the scariest part. You could feel it shift. Back at the DOJ, Quinn met with Agent Tramble in a small conference room. He was back in his work clothes, charcoal blazer, grey button-up, and a quiet watch that probably cost more than her car. He didn't look tired. He looked ready to move on. "We're holding the line on our end," she said. "Just need your statement for records. You're not obligated to speak to the media, and no one above you expects you to." "Good," Tramble said. "I don't plan to. You sure?" Quinn asked. "The narrative's already out there." He leaned back slightly. "The people who need to know already know. The rest will do what they always do. Talk. Forget. Move on. You don't want to put your voice into it? Tramble's face was steady. My voice was already there, in the silence. But silence carries farther than shouting when the right people are listening, and this time, they were listening. By Saturday afternoon, the body cam footage had already been dissected from every angle. People slowed it down, added subtitles, zoomed in on expressions, matched it to the dispatch timeline, and even layered commentary from former law enforcement experts on top. It wasn't just news. It had become part of the national conversation. Clips aired across cable. Podcasts broke it down line by line. On social media, one post gained nearly 1 million likes within 24 hours. It was a freeze frame of Officer Fenwick's face, just as Agent Tramble said, "You already decided what you saw before you asked a single question." The caption read, "And that's the whole story." The department scrambled to issue a formal statement. The Fayetteville Police Department acknowledges public concern regarding a traffic stop involving a federal employee. We are conducting a full internal review. Officer Troy Fenwick has been placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation. We will not comment further at this time. It was a carefully worded announcement, reviewed by 3 attorneys and rewritten 4 times before it went out. But it didn't matter. The internet had already made up its mind. Troy Fenwick, once just another patrol officer in a mid-sized town, had become a symbol of overreach, of bias, of what happens when authority isn't backed by judgment. And yet, Tramble said nothing. No interviews, no press conferences, no retweets, nothing. This silence only added to the weight of what people saw on camera. For every person shouting in outrage, there was someone quietly absorbing it, letting the images speak for themselves. Not just the confrontation, but the posture, the control, the refusal to be baited. Inside the FBI's Charlotte field office, Tramble sat in his usual spot at the end of the 4th floor conference table. His colleagues were careful not to hover or ask questions. They knew him, knew the way he handled pressure. One junior analyst, a man named Tarek Joshi, walked past the break room and quietly said, "Hell of a thing, sir." Tramble gave him a small nod. Not dismissive, just enough to acknowledge the words without inviting more. A supervisor came by later that day, holding a manila envelope. Media requests, a few big names. Anderson Cooper's team even asked for an off-record chat. Tramble shook his head without opening it. Not interested. You sure? Could flip this whole thing into a bigger conversation. It already is, Tramble replied. They don't need my face to tell it. Meanwhile, Fenwick sat alone in his apartment. The blinds were closed. His phone was off. A half-finished sandwich sat untouched on a plate. His name was still on Twitter. Still trending, though a few newer scandals were creeping up to replace him in the algorithm. He'd been called every name imaginable. Some defended him, others tore him apart. What hit hardest weren't the threats or insults. It was the former academy classmate who wrote, "This didn't have to happen. You could have just respected the man." That one stuck in his head more than the rest. Because deep down, Troy knew something had shifted in those first 30 seconds of the stop. He had felt the instinct to de-escalate, and ignored it. He chose ego over professionalism, and now the whole country had seen it. Back at the precinct, the chief met with the city's legal advisor behind closed doors. Not because they expected charges, there were no physical altercations, no drawn weapons, but because the damage had already been done. Trust was bleeding out across the community, and the chief knew he'd be answering questions for months. And still, no lawsuit came, no press tour, no attempt by Tramble to capitalize on the moment. That's what disturbed Troy most. He had expected fire and fury, expected the kind of backlash that came with anger and calls for justice. But what he got, instead, was worse. Quiet dignity. The kind that doesn't just hurt your career. It makes you question your entire sense of self. That night, a news anchor said something that cut deeper than any headline. What we saw on that roadside wasn't just a bad stop. It was a mirror. And some people don't like what they see staring back. But not everyone turned away. Some stared into that mirror and started asking different questions, the kind that don't go away after the camera's turned off. By Monday morning, Officer Troy Fenwick's badge was locked inside a drawer at the precinct, his access key revoked, his cruiser reassigned, and his name removed from the weekly shift calendar. The Internal Affairs Review was officially underway, and though the investigation would take weeks, everyone already knew where this was heading. Troy walked through the front entrance of the station in plain clothes, escorted by an HR liaison to a side office where his administrative leave paperwork waited. He didn't try to argue. Not this time. The room was sterile and quiet. He signed where they told him to sign, filled in today's date, initialed in all the right boxes. A manila envelope was handed to him. His next step instructions, mental health support options, contact details for union representation. Nobody said anything they didn't have to. Outside, 2 local reporters waited across the street, camera ready. Troy dipped his head, kept walking, and avoided eye contact. He'd been warned not to speak. His union rep had been blunt. Every word you say now will only make things worse. Back at his apartment, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a worn-out coffee mug that still had yesterday's grounds in the bottom. The TV was on, volume low. Another panel was discussing him. Again. He muted it. His phone buzzed. A text from his younger brother, Colin. "I know you're going through it, but damn, man. What were you thinking?" Troy didn't respond. What could he say? That he didn't see it coming? That he didn't think it would matter? That he didn't expect him, of all people, to be someone with real power? He thought about that moment. The badge. The way Tramble held it out quietly, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. No theatrics, no force, just a professional doing what professionals do. And Troy, a trained officer, had decided in a split second that it didn't matter. That miscalculation was now tattooed on his reputation. Across town, at a small independent bookstore on Watauga Street, a retired black teacher named Ms. Etta Cromwell hosted her weekly book club. Usually they discussed novels, sometimes politics, sometimes personal essays. Today they were talking about that video. "I didn't even get angry," she said, sipping lukewarm tea. "Just tired. Because I've had that moment too. Not on a road, not with a badge, but in a school hallway, in a grocery store, in an office lobby. Someone looking at me like I shouldn't be where I already am." A younger woman across from her, Kendall, nodded. The part that hit me was how calm he stayed. Like, he didn't just know who he was. He knew they'd find out eventually. Another member added, "And that officer, you could see it. The moment he realized. That split-second panic when he knew he'd gone too far but couldn't walk it back." The conversation wasn't just happening in coffee shops or book clubs. City officials were holding quiet meetings with clergy and community leaders. School administrators were being asked to review how bias training intersected with public safety. Fayetteville was small enough for people to know each other, and big enough for everyone to have an opinion. Back at the federal building, Tramble stood at a window overlooking a busy street below. His supervisor, Deputy Director Evelyn Knox, stood beside him, arms folded. "You sure you don't want to transfer?" she asked. "No." "You're going to be a symbol now. You know that." "I didn't ask to be." "That's not the point." He turned toward her. "I do my job. I serve this country. And I handled myself the way I've handled myself every other day." She studied his face. "You think people will learn from it?" "Some will," he said. "Others won't. That's how this works." "And Fenwick?" Tramble didn't blink. "He'll carry it longer than I will." Outside, people were still talking, still watching the video, still reposting the clip of Tramble saying, "You already decided what you saw." But for Troy Fenwick, it wasn't a viral moment anymore. It was a permanent pause in the middle of his career, one he couldn't explain away, one he'd relive every time he heard that sentence in someone else's mouth. But what he didn't know was that his real reckoning hadn't come yet. And it would hit him where it hurt the most. By Tuesday, it wasn't just national media talking. It was the local barbershops, churches, diners, and PTA meetings. Fayetteville had found itself in the middle of a storm that wasn't going to pass quickly. At Kenny's Cut and Curl on Ramsey Street, the chairs were full and the air buzzed, Not with clippers, but with opinions. "He stayed cool the whole time," said one man in the corner, shaking his head. "Didn't even raise his voice. That's the part that got me." A teenager in the next chair piped up, "Man, I don't know how he held it in. I would have snapped." Kenny, the shop's owner, lowered the lever on his barber chair and chimed in, "That's why you ain't him. He knew exactly who he was. Didn't have to prove it to anybody." At a community center across town, Reverend Glenard Boone hosted a town hall. It wasn't planned. It came together within 24 hours after a dozen concerned residents called asking if they could talk. Not protest, not yell, just talk. The room was packed. Teachers, veterans, nurses, parents. One woman in the back stood and said softly, "It's not just about that officer. It's about the part of you that gets used to being second-guessed. Like you could have 5 degrees, a badge, a clearance level higher than your mayor, and still be asked if you belong here." Reverend Boone let that hang in the air before responding. "And what do we do with that feeling? We teach our kids to stand taller," she said. "And not just ours. Theirs, too." On the other side of town, inside a mid-tier sandwich shop, 2 officers in uniform quietly ate lunch. They kept their voices low, didn't want to be overheard. "I used to work with Fenwick," one said between bites. "He wasn't a bad guy. He wasn't a good one either," the other replied. "Just figured the badge covered more than it did." There was no official poll, but if you listened close enough, you could hear where the town stood. Some people thought the whole thing was blown out of proportion. Others thought it wasn't blown up enough. Even a group of high school students at Northview High started organizing a forum with their social studies teacher. "We want to talk about what happens when people in power make assumptions," one of the seniors told her principal. "It's not about bashing the police, it's about understanding how fast things can go wrong." Meanwhile, inside the modest living room of Alberta Dawes, a 71-year-old retired librarian and Fayetteville native, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her nephew had posted a long Facebook story about the incident, and suddenly Alberta was being asked to share her take with local radio. "I saw enough in that one clip to last me another lifetime," she said on air. "That man stood still, spoke clear, and reminded everybody watching that silence can speak volumes. And I hope folks remember that before they open their mouth next time." At the police station, Chief Roberto Shankly sat in his office with a thick file on his desk labeled Fenwick, Troy. His staff had reviewed every stop the officer had made in the past 18 months. A few patterns stood out: who he stopped, how long the stops lasted, how many warnings versus citations were issued. The numbers weren't pretty. The chief leaned back, exhausted. He wasn't new to controversy, but this one hit differently. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a window into something people in town had been whispering about for years, and now they had proof. He called in Captain Laura Gunther, a level-headed supervisor with a sharp eye for patterns. "I want a training refresh across the board," he told her. "Bias recognition, de-escalation, federal protocol, all of it." "You think that's gonna fix this?" "No," he said. "But I don't want another name going viral for the wrong reason." Word quietly spread that Officer Fenwick's career was hanging by a thread. Nobody said it out loud, but most knew he wouldn't be back on the street. Not in this town. Back at the Crosswinds Hotel, Agent Tramble sat near a window, watching the rain begin to tap the glass. He'd made no media appearances, filed no lawsuit, and still, his silence echoed louder than anyone shouting on camera. He'd become a mirror, and the town was looking into it, seeing things it couldn't unsee. But before it all faded, one final moment was coming, one encounter that neither man saw coming, and it would say more than any headline ever could. 2 weeks after the stop, the firestorm had cooled. The headlines moved on. Another scandal. Another outrage. But Fayetteville hadn't forgotten. Troy Fenwick had remained on administrative leave while the department dragged through its internal review. The union rep kept him updated, but the outcome was clear. Even if he kept his badge, there was nowhere left to wear it. Not in this town. On a late Thursday afternoon, Troy drove across town to pick up groceries. Not his usual spot. He'd started shopping out of the way to avoid awkward glances. He walked through the aisles of a small, quiet store off Morganton Road, hoping to be invisible. Ball cap down, sunglasses on, cart half empty. He turned a corner near the frozen section and stopped cold. There he was, Deshaun Tramble, standing alone in front of the glass door, reaching for a carton of almond milk. No fanfare, no entourage, just him, in a grey polo and jeans, civilian clothes. Troy's throat tightened. He didn't expect to run into him, didn't even know Tramble was still in town. Part of him wanted to back away, vanish down another aisle, but another part, the smaller, braver one, pushed his feet forward. "Agent Tramble," he said quietly. Tramble turned, hand still on the door. He didn't flinch, didn't react with hostility, just looked at him. Troy took a breath. "I don't know if this is appropriate, or if you even care, but I owe you an apology." Tramble didn't move. For what exactly? For assuming, for escalating, for not listening. You were calm the whole time, and I didn't respect that. I saw someone who didn't match what I thought I'd see in that car. That's on me. There was a pause. It stretched, but didn't suffocate. "You didn't just assume, Officer Fenwick," Tramble said. "You acted like your uniform excused the assumption." Troy nodded, slowly. "I know." More silence. Then Tramble looked at him again. Really looked. Not as a threat, not as a symbol. Just as a man. "Do better," he said. "Next time, whoever it is, doesn't have to be me." "I will," Troy replied, meaning it in a way he hadn't meant much in weeks. Tramble gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned, grabbed his almond milk, and walked toward checkout. That was it. No grand gesture, no handshakes, no forgiveness ceremony. Just one man giving another the chance to sit with the truth and move forward differently. Later that night, Troy sat at his kitchen table again. The mug was washed now. The TV was off. He pulled out a notebook and wrote a single sentence. "Real power doesn't need to shout to be heard." Across town, Tramble packed his bag. His rotation in Fayetteville was over. Another assignment waited. Another city. But something lingered here. Not bitterness, not even frustration. Just the memory of how far silence could travel when it held weight. Before he zipped up his bag, he slid a folder inside. Notes from the internal review, transcripts of his brief call that day, and a copy of the department's updated training procedures. A quiet reminder that sometimes real change doesn't come from lawsuits or cameras, but from one man refusing to meet ignorance with rage. The next morning, Fayetteville looked the same. Traffic lights blinked. Kids waited at bus stops. But in small, invisible ways, things had shifted. A few more conversations, a few less assumptions, one fewer badge worn carelessly, and a question that would stay with the town longer than the headlines. What if Agent Tramble hadn't been who he was? Some questions don't need answers. They need attention. And as for Tramble, he didn't need vindication. He already had what the other man lost the moment he stepped out of his cruiser: composure, clarity, and power that didn't need to make a scene to be felt. If this story made you think, share it, talk about it, ask yourself where you'd stand. And if you're still listening, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the quietest stories leave the loudest echoes.